I've thought for a long time that we can't really understand religious child maltreatment or cultural child maltreatment until we understand the pressures and the influences on their caretakers, their parents, the people that they love and the people they look to for support and care. So that's what we're going to look into today. To give you an idea of the format, each of the panelists will give an introduction, tell you a little bit about themselves. We have Roger and Joellen Griffin here who will speak together, and then Trish Taylor will give an introduction, followed by John and Kathy at the end. One thing that I want to mention to those who are watching the live streaming or will watch the videos later on, the last two members of the panel, John and Kathy, are not going to be visible on camera. You'll hear from them, but you won't see them, and I'll let them explain to you their reasons why. But I think we'll just get started. So I want to say that I was thrilled to have gotten to know Roger and Joellen Griffin. They raised their children in a group that I've written about. It's one of the most severe authoritarian faith groups I've ever run across, certainly when it comes to how they expect parents to raise their kids. So with that, I'll just turn it over to them.
Thank you. It's interesting to sit here and hear you say that this couple was involved in a most severe group that treated children. I'm thinking, how did I ever get there? Because no one ever thinks they're going to join a cult. No one would ever want to join a cult. But it's a deceptive thing that happens to you, and you don't know. It's like the analogy of the boiling water with the frog. It just gradually happens, and then suddenly you're tangled up and you don't know what's happened to you. But just to give you a little bit of background about myself, I grew up a Christian. My dad is a Baptist preacher. I was a very strong Christian. I preached my first sermon when I was 14. I intended to be some sort of a pastor or a social worker working with youth or something, and I went to a school called Tennessee Temple, which is in Chattanooga, and I was a seeker, and I was not really sure that I wanted to be a conservative, ultra-conservative Christian, which is the way I was being steered. So I got involved in a group that had a little restaurant in Chattanooga called the Yellow Deli. I got recruited through the Yellow Deli. I see a couple of faces light up. That's the recruiting outlet for the 12 tribes, and I got sucked into that. And actually, in about 1977 is when I joined, and met my wife there, and we got married. And this is 20 years condensed, very short, but our lives were wonderful. We had 6 children. Our lives together were wonderful. We had 6 children in the group. The group developed over the years to be very isolated, very withdrawn from society. When we first joined, it was a group that we thought was going to be a ministry reaching out to the body of Christ. But as our leader led us on, what ended up happening is we became recognized and self-proclaimed as the only thing that God was doing on the earth. So we became very isolated from all other Christianity. So I just wanted to explain a little bit particularly about the relationship of parents and children, and it was a huge part in our life. We got married in '79. We had our first child in 1980. What ended up happening around that time, and around 1980, is the group began to emphasize that we needed to raise a pure and spotless generation, and that we were going to be able to do that by being very, very diligent to discipline. And our leader started reading verses out of Proverbs 20, I think it's 20:30, kind of became one of our most famous verses that we quote. It says, "The blueness of the wound drives away evil." So we were very proud of the fact that we were bruising our children. And I'm sorry to say that, but it's exactly what we did. We systematically, severely disciplined our children with the belief that we were driving away evil from those children, and foolishness was bound up in the heart of a child, and the rod of correction drives it far from them. I think that's probably King James, I'm not sure. But, we quoted all of that stuff a lot. And what ended up happening in our family, I was the leader, I was an elder in the group. And because I was an elder, the other members of the group felt obligated to, one of the things that happens in a group like that is there's a tremendous amount of pressure to not give in to your parental or maternal instincts to protect your children. And so there was a lot of emphasis that we would go beyond our natural restraint and be more severe in our discipline. So there was always pressure to discipline severely and to make sure that you didn't give in to the cries of your children. So being a leader, we were subjected to being watched. So we were under a lot of social pressure to be even more severe than we would have been in our natural heart to be, if you understand. And there was this, I wanted to be a leader, and I wanted to remain in good standing. So I was under a lot of social pressure to be a good example for spanking my children, which turned out to be, as I got free from it and looked back, was really severe and very, very abusive. But I don't know if any of you know about this, but in 1984, our group was so dominant on this issue, and we spoke out so much about abuse, about spanking our children, blueness of the womb. We were very proud of it. We talked about it everywhere. The state of Vermont came in and tried to arrest and sweep up all the kids in our group and tried to do an examination. Well, it turns out that we were all taken in for 1 day custody, but none of our children were ever examined. And we ended up, there was a liberal judge that stepped in and stopped the whole thing and had us all go home. And so our kids never got examined. Of course, the group says, praise God, we were vindicated. But the truth is, if they would have been able to have examined the children, they would have found a tremendous amount of evidence of abuse, but it never happened. And so since then, unfortunately, the state of Vermont, which we were in northern Vermont at the time in Island Pond, since then the state of Vermont has just adopted a hands-off approach to dealing with the group, trying to deal with the abuse, poor education, poor medical care for the children. So that's basically what I wanted to say. I did want to just briefly mention, some folks want to know why we left. Well, we were there for 20 years. How did that ever happen? I can talk more about that if anybody wants to ask later. But basically what happened with us is my wife got sick, and because the group did not accept sickness, very similar to some of the other groups we've talked about, as that there must be something's wrong, God must be judging you somehow. We just really got scrutinized. And the group ended up being very harsh toward us, even though this was our only life that we knew. We'd been there for 15, 18 years. But they got very harsh and very severe with us, and it ended up just devastating us. We started having questions and doubts about the group. And then I began to look around and say, if this group is really not who we think it is, if we're not really doing what we say we're doing, what are our kids going to do when we leave? How are our kids going to survive? We didn't have birth certificates. Our kids were not registered with the state. They never had immunizations. They had never had any formal education. They didn't know anything except the Old Testament. So I started doing things like, I'm probably getting close to my time here, but I started doing things like reading the classics to our children, and privately, yeah. And we got in trouble a couple of times for reading The Education of Little Tree, or
there'd be other children's, other families' children outside our door listening in to the stories.
I would read Animal Farm to my kids, and there would be outside the door of our bedroom, there would be 2 or 3 kids out there just listening because they were really intrigued by it. But toward the end of our stay, our lives just kind of started to unravel, and we just no longer had the faith. And once you begin to think for yourself, then things started unraveling. So my family invited us to come and live with them if we ever wanted to get away for a while, so we took them up on it. But I think my wife probably wants to talk a little more about that.
Well, I can talk a lot about the difficult things that went on in the group, but if you go to their website, you can see how they paint a picture of just being a loving family, caring, giving, working together, cooking together, raising their kids together. And outwardly, it all seems really cool. They have restaurants that people patronize because they just think, oh, these people are really down to earth, organic, but it's what happens when you are in there after you've been committed, because they don't tell you up front, oh, yeah, well, you're going to have to severely discipline your children because that's just how our children are raised. Because if you knew that ahead of time, you would just say, all right, I'm not going to go for that. But it just kind of happens gradually. And, we joined before we were married, didn't have children. Not too many people did at that time. And then the child training teachings came in. And they were, I fell for it. They said, well, we need to have the next generation take the baton, like in a marathon, how you pass the baton. So we just had this vision that we'd pass the baton to them, and they would take it and run, because we would just be exhausted at that time. But then those children started growing up and leaving. And we left when our kids were still between the age of 1 and 14. So there weren't a lot of kids leaving at that time. Leaving and getting reoriented out in the real world was so difficult because the children hadn't been exposed to anything like the media, TV, music, books, movies, public schools. So they get thrown in that. We get out and I'm like, well, should we homeschool them? And I tried that for a while, and I just I am not equipped to homeschool all these children. So we put them in public schools, and we had difficulty one of our sons really wanted to make friends. And the kids picked up on his innocence and just kind of took advantage of it. And they said, hey, before you turn your paper in, write F-U-C-K on it. So he'd write it on it, and he'd turn in his paper because he just wanted to make friends. And the teachers would call me, and I'd go into school, and I'm like, how am I going to get them to understand? I'm trying to adjust. My kids are trying to adjust, and it's just like we're off the wall. But we stayed together and worked through it, and the children are intact, and several of them live real near us, and so we consider ourselves very blessed. But after being in there, I joined when I was in 1975, and then married him a couple years later. And I remember at one point, after 13 years of raising children, and being communally raising children, like it takes a village, and I'm like, I don't like that at all. But you get everybody else involved in disciplining your children and telling you what your child did. And when you have a large family, people are always coming up to you, Ezra did this and Hannah did that, and you're just like, one of them always needs to be taken and spanked. I'd take them in the room and I'd go, now tell me what happened. And they'd tell me, and I'd go, well, I'd end up not disciplining them a lot of times. And then if somebody asked me, after the fact, if I had disciplined them, I'd say, well, I talked with them and I just decided they didn't really need it. Then I would get in trouble because I didn't receive my brothers. Because your brothers and sisters are considered the body of Christ, and that's where His Spirit is. So if you don't receive them, you're not receiving Christ. So it gets really difficult to maintain raising your children, training them, and making sure you're walking on eggshells and not doing anything wrong. Anyway, in 1993, after I had my 6th child, I remember standing in my bedroom, and I had a few minutes where I was alone, apparently. And I remember the first time that I had let myself think outside of maintaining this lifestyle. I wonder what it would be like to have my own place to raise my children. And I disregarded it as soon as it came in. But I think that was the first time since 1975 that I had an independent thought. And so it was a couple of years later that we left. Okay. Wow, I only got to there. Okay. Well, the discipline really, you fit your child in a box, and the child training teachings are made by a couple who never had children. and you're trying to fit your children in a box. And if your children are real high energy and inquisitive and creative, and it's very difficult to get them to fit in that box. Some people's children complied really well. They didn't have to get spanked hardly ever, and it's usually because the parents' personalities were that way. But the combination of us apparently made some really energetic children. And and then when we left, we knew we wanted to stop corporal punishment, but we didn't really know what to replace it with. So that was a transition that was very difficult, and I still don't know quite what I would tell people if they were in that same situation, how to do it, but except to hang in there.
Well, let me say this: as you're growing normal parents, you have a little child that grows up, and you learn what they're going to play with at age 2, what they're going to wear, what you're going to let them do in kindergarten, what you're going to let them watch in junior high, what they're going to do. Well, in our situation, we had to make all of those decisions from age 1 to age 14 immediately, and we didn't have an idea at all. And so we all kind of learned together as a family, and it really, even stressful, it brought us together as a family, and we got through it together as a family.
We did have a son die in a car accident, like after we had been out maybe a year. And we got a phone call from one of our old friends that still lived in the community. And he said, well, now that God has hit you over the head with a 2x4, are you going to move back in? And I said, I'm really sorry you think that way, because that is the farthest thing from our mind. But so what we would hear later on is the group would tell their children that Israel died when he left, and another family lost a son too in a car accident, and use that fear to keep the kids there. And if I was in a town where there was a group, I would approach one of the elders, and I said, why are you telling them that because my son died, that was God's judgment, and that was the best thing that could happen because we took him away from the community? Oh, we're not saying that. But whenever a young teenager would leave, I would ask them, are they saying that to you? And he said, yeah, that's what they tell us, And but they'll deny it. So anyway, I guess that's it for now.
Thank you. And I really want to express my appreciation for you both being here, and the rest of you too. I mean, there are very few people who will come up and speak publicly or even privately to talk honestly about what kind of child rearing techniques they used and so forth when they have regret looking back on it. And so I just really appreciate you all being with us today. Well, I've known Trish Taylor for quite some time, even before I got into this issue, I think. And I just appreciate you being here and talking about the years that you spent raising your kids in Jehovah's Witnesses. So I'll let you go now.
Okay. Well, I was one of Jehovah's Witnesses for about 15 years, but I didn't start out that way. I was raised in a Southern Baptist family, and of course, in that capacity, I heard a lot of sermons about the book of Revelation and all of that horrible imagery. The destruction and so forth. So I was ripe when Jehovah's Witnesses finally found me. I was really an anxious child, and so I worried about this constantly. I never really even planned for the future because I didn't think I was going to have a future. I just thought the world was going to end and that was going to be it. In fact, when my daughter I had a daughter when I was 19, and I just thought she would never live to grow up. In my early 20s, I found myself in New Orleans and as a single mom, and I met a man in a bar on Bourbon Street who would later introduce me to Jehovah's Witnesses. And that's a totally different story. We can tell that another time. It's pretty interesting, actually. But so he started talking to me about the new world and how, yes, I was right, that the world, this society was going to end, but there was going to be a paradise earth and we could live forever in it. My daughter and I could live forever in this paradise. But if I didn't conform to the witness teachings, then my daughter would be destroyed. So I was not really too excited about changing my lifestyle. I was happy with what I was doing, the way I was living. But after about a year of struggling over this, I finally realized that I just couldn't live with myself thinking that my daughter is going to die because of my selfishness is kind of the way I thought about it. So I loaded her up and left New Orleans and went to Houston and jumped full force with all 4 feet right into Jehovah's Witnesses. A couple of years later, I was married. The man that I married was not a witness at first when we met. He became a witness. Never figured out yet whether he really believed it or he just wanted to marry me. I don't know. But anyway, he did get baptized, and we got married. And of course, the spiel that the witnesses gave us was, well, you know, the man is the head of the family, and he's responsible for disciplining the children, and the wife has to be submissive and so forth. And I'm surprised nobody's mentioned that scripture about if you beat him with a rod, he will not die, because that was something we heard. Oh, yeah, beat your kids. You don't want them to die, so you want to discipline them. He was my husband. We were both very young, and he had been a single man, never had children or small children around. So he really didn't have the emotional maturity to take this responsibility he was given. And I think he kind of resented my daughter because she was not his. So I feel like now, looking back on it, that he really used this rhetoric that they were feeding him about discipline and being the head and so forth as an excuse to physically and emotionally abuse her. When I complained to let me just say that as far as I know, and I believe she would tell me, she was never sexually abused, although later on, like just a few years ago, she told me that one of her best friends, who was the daughter of an elder in the congregation, had been abused by her father, which since I've gotten out of that organization, I've found that that's happened a lot. I mean, it's rampant. If you listen to a lot of the people that I've talked to in support groups. Anyway, my daughter didn't have to go through that, but she did have to go through a lot of physical and emotional and mental abuse. And when I would complain to the elders about it, and what I would hear from them was, well, you know, he's the head, and you just have to be patient, kind of like what some of the others have said today, is you have to be understanding, you have to be patient, you have to be supportive. So I stayed married to him for about 12 years, and we had 2 children together, 2 sons. He later on fell away or stopped being a witness, and at that time I thought, well, good, the elders are going to tell me I don't have to put up with this anymore. But no, he was still my husband. Even though he wasn't a witness anymore, I was still supposed to be submissive and just put up with it when he harshly disciplined my daughter. About 12 years after I got into it, or about 12 years after we got married, a couple of things happened. One was I had 2 sons, and one of them, my youngest son, was a toddler, and he was very hyperactive. And in Jehovah's Witnesses congregation, there's no separate religious education for children. The children have to sit in the meeting room with the parents, and they're expected to sit still and listen, and if they don't, you're supposed to take them out and spank them and make them sit still and listen. Well, this youngest son of mine wasn't having any of that. So we had meetings 3 days a week, but because on 2 of those days there were 5 meetings. There were 2 meetings on 2 of the days, so we had 5 meetings during the week. That was 5 hours of indoctrination that we were receiving. But because I had to spend so much time going out with him, I think that in some way that kind of broke the spell for me. I kind of was, I didn't have to listen to that so much. At the same time, I had a really good friend in the congregation, another woman who had a very, very, very abusive husband. My husband was never abusive to me, but hers was. And in fact, I used to say, the only positive thing I can say about her husband is that he makes my husband look good, because he was just horrible. And I remember once he had abused her so badly that she had been in the hospital. And I went to visit her, and she was so proud, and she told me, the circuit overseer, which is the traveling overseer that goes around to different congregations, she said he came to see me, and he told me I was being such a faithful wife, and he encouraged me, and he just said I was doing such a good job. And at that time, I just thought, what is wrong with these people, that they are not only condoning this behavior, but they are actually encouraging her to stay in and continue to be abused like she was. So I think those two things together kind of happened at the same time, and it kind of made me start doubting. And I left my abusive husband and the abusive religion both the same time. I just decided to get out. I then went to college and for myself. That was 28 years ago. Let's see. I think I had a couple of things else I wanted to say. Oh, I was going to talk. My daughter is still a witness. She's 47 years old now, and for her, I think it works. She has a good husband, a beautiful home. They travel. They didn't have any children by choice, which I'm glad, because I don't think I could stand it if I had grandchildren that I couldn't see all the time. She and I talk to each other, but because of the rules on disfellowshipping and shunning and so forth, and disassociation, she doesn't really have as much to do with me as we would both like, I think. They moved all the way up to Oregon to... So I think she didn't have to live close to me. So I'm really missed. She's my only daughter, and I really miss the relationship that we had. My sons, fortunately, I think I got out of the organization soon enough to get. One of them goes to a Christian church, but it's not a church that uses religion as an excuse for hate. So I'm kind of okay with that. And my youngest son, that one that helped me get free, is not a joiner at all. That he meditates. So they're both doing pretty well now. Since I've been out of the organization, I've met quite a few people who were Jehovah's Witnesses, and some of the stories I've heard are just horrendous. So when I talk to people now, I tell them, when I'm telling people my story, I say, I spent 14 years in an abusive cult, and I really do believe it. It's an abusive cult. And I'm so glad I'm out. I'm free. So, thank you.
And I hope that later on we'll talk about some of the emotional and psychological issues as well, and you will hear about that now when we hear from John. I've interviewed John before, and he has quite an amazing story to tell about his childhood. John and Kathy are here kind of in a different way than the other two stories, and I'll let them describe it. But they're relatively new parents, and so and they were raised in very different faith communities. So that's going to be part of our discussion as well. So I'll let you guys go.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? I was raised in a very evangelical home. My father initially was not a Christian, and my mom and dad had my eldest sister, and they were separated for 3 years. And my dad became born again, and it was very full throttle. He was led to Jesus by my mother's brother, and I think more or less it was the way the marriage was going to work. And he became a contemporary Christian music singer, traveling around to churches. And some of my earliest memories are, singing in church and that sort of thing. When I was 3 years old, things took a sharp turn. That's when they became evangelical. They were just Baptist, run-of-the-mill, not asking a whole lot of deep questions, just sort of going to church and congregating and being moral people, which is probably what I would have been more of a fan of. We started meeting in my uncle's living room, and this church now is still going on. It's, I think, over 1,000 members at this point. They've been involved in starting 2 different churches. So this particular church, they got this preacher. I think he was 19 or 20 years old, never been to a theology school, was uneducated. In fact, maybe just a year or 2 before, he was partying in college and doing LSD and all that sort of thing. And he heard a word from God, and he became a preacher. Anyhow, so in this church, as the further it went on, the sort of weirder the church got. We did things like, exorcise demons out of witches in church. I was involved in, lots of abortion protests, where my young eyes and ears were hearing what was going on far too early. I'm holding up signs of decapitated babies and things like that. And, it was the type of situation where God and Satan controlled everything, every aspect of life. We weren't allowed to even eat at this Crystal Burger place because they've got a glass ball as a logo or whatever. Everything was evil. There were kids in my church who couldn't watch Sesame Street because the Count Dracula person or whatever. So what happened was, this was a brand new church. There was this whole group of kids that I was with that were basically the guinea pigs of this style of raising kids in our community. And we were all raised with a huge weight on our shoulders. Number one, we were very, very fearful for ourselves. I was never scared of the boogeyman. I was scared of demon possession as a child. And it's traumatizing. And the weird thing is, I even asked Janet, why do you want me to do this? Why is my story interesting? I was never hit on over the head or sexually abused or anything like that. And I read her book, and God, there's such crazy stories out there that I almost feel like mine pales in comparison. But the danger with this type of abuse that I've gone through is it creeps into your mind and in your heart and your psyche, and it'll never let you go. I've got post-traumatic stress disorder. I've been in therapy for over 15 years. I'm 33. I probably will never be completely okay. Part of the reason I didn't want to be filmed, my parents are still active, and they watch things like this. It would be rare, and probably they wouldn't, but somebody may know them. And where I come from, I'm in the closet at this point. I identify as an atheist at this point. I'm very happy with that decision for the first time in my life. I don't, have this heavy weight of guilt in my heart. There was a gentleman over here that talked about being in a cult and its power and its manipulation, and that's what I had to go through. And
Excuse me, John, I don't mean to interrupt. If you wanted to cover something else, please do. But I also wanted to hear from Kathy to talk about how her upbringing was different, and then if you could also discuss you both as parents a little bit. I think that would be enlightening. Can you do that?
So I grew up completely different. Grew up in an Episcopal household. Looking back now, believe my father was an atheist. So never was really exposed to all this that Jacob has brought into my life, or John, excuse me. We have a son that is 5 and very inquisitive, asks a lot of questions. We are actually at an Episcopal school. I work there, and our son goes there. So chapel is a big part of his life, and so he has lots of questions. And so Jacob and I are just, trying to decide what we are going to tell him. I'm agnostic, so I was just kind of raised not, I use a religious household loosely. We were not, Jesus and Bible and all of that was not really a big part of my life. So I guess we are just trying to figure out what we are going to teach him. I kind of go about teaching him about God and Jesus like I do Santa. I answer his questions with what I know. My hope for him is that he questions everything always and is never going about things believing what he is exactly told and taught. So my thing with him, and it's kind of different for John, from what he's grown up in, but I just answer his questions, and when he gets older, we'll tell him my story. He actually did ask me the other day if I believe in God, which was a really big question, and I said, well, some people do and some people don't, and it's fine if you do and it's fine if you don't. I want you to believe what you want to believe, and you can Google it if you want to, and I'll read it to you. So that's kind of where I am. He has kind of a different standpoint on it because he feels like we're lying to him, but he still believes in Santa and the Tooth Fairy, and I'm not going to take that away from him right now. So I'm not going to take Jesus and God from him either until he's old enough to decide for himself what he wants to believe. And whatever he does, I will, if it's within, reason, I will support him and, help him with whatever he needs help with.
Growing up in this community, I think with the different religions and cults that I've spoken today, I think a common thread is that children are always targeted. My church was very big on children. Children are the most important thing in the world. They're our next generation. That's very heavy for a child. Don't tell a child that. I mean, the fact is, I literally felt my generation was responsible with how the world was going to turn out. I was a miracle child. My mother had a tumor the size of an orange, and it disappeared after they prayed. I wasn't there, or I guess I wasn't conscious. So I was always instilled with the fact that I was this miracle child. I was expected to be a preacher. My parents, growing up, they told me that I was a prophet, that I had a prophetic gift. Do you understand how much that separates you as a person from everyone? Because when you turn 12 and you start developing a sexuality and everything is so taboo, you can't talk about it, you have this huge feeling of guilt in your heart. And on one side of the coin, you're too worldly for church. On the other side of the coin, you're too much of a holy roller for school. You're a freak. And I think as 5th grade, I led over 200 kids to Jesus or something. I kept a scorecard. And that's what I was known for. Until I wasn't. Until things went wrong. I've been in and out of therapy for a long time, like I've said. My parents didn't really believe in psychiatric help or psychology, or so for a long time I only was able to get counseling from my pastor, who basically told me it was the devil, and I was exorcised on a number of occasions. Come to find out, I have panic attack disorder. I'm clinically depressed. Now I have PTSD, probably thanks to all that business. The fact is, religion is too heavy for children, in my opinion. I don't really care what your religion is. I think it's too heavy. We target them, and I think it's unfair. They have not developed their whereabouts yet to make decisions for themselves. They look up to us. They take what we say as fact. And if you want a real Christian or a real whatever, wouldn't you rather them come to that conclusion on their own, with their own intelligence and their own life experiences? I may be wrong, in going to hell at this point. I think compared to what happened, I'm okay with that.
Thanks. I'm going to ask one question of you folks here, and then open it up to questions from people in the audience. You spoke a little bit, Joellen, about, or maybe you did, Roger, how you have to, raising a child in an environment like that, you have to stuff your parental instinct to care for your child. And, we've heard about some of the, teachings and how they affect children. And I just want to point out that in the 12 tribes, they don't permit children to imagine, to fantasize. In Jehovah's Witnesses, there are all kinds of fear tactics relating to the end of the world and who's going to be left behind and who's not, etc. Could you talk about an example of where you felt that you were expected to behave a certain way in terms of how you were going to teach your child or discipline your child or interact with a child in some way that didn't feel right, and what that experience was like, how you went through that? If the three of you could talk, and then I might have another question for you guys.
A couple of situations come to mind. One of them's a little lighter than the other. I remember incidents once where I got personally in a lot of hassle, a lot of trouble in the group for this because our child slid down the banister. He was 5 years old, and I said, and he was laughing, and I said, "Don't do that." And got him off the banister, and that was the end of it as far as I was concerned. That's dangerous. You could break the banister. You could hurt yourself. But someone thought that him doing that was a disregard of authority because the word had been shared at the table, that at our dinner table, that no one was to slide down the banister. So they thought it was a deliberate, projected as if I had jumped up there and slid down it, which would have been a little different. So I was forced to discipline my child, even though I didn't agree with it. I had to do it because that was the system that I was under. So that certainly comes to mind. And as looking back on it, it's very embarrassing, But that was the system that I was in, and I was very much manipulated and controlled by it. So you got a situation?
I mean, every day there were situations that I would have let my children get away with, but taking a pillow and pretending it was a doll was fantasy. Taking a rock and pretending, or a piece of wood, pretending it was a truck was fantasy. And that you were supposed to keep your child's mind engaged at all times so that they wouldn't go into fantasy. Playing, that word was not to be used. They were just supposed to be kept busy all the time. And it was like, At one house that we lived in, we had a big window that overlooked the backyard. So I remember letting them go outside and play while I nursed one of them. And I would get in trouble for that because they were kind of unsupervised. And so it was just a tense years of, waking up and knowing that I had to keep all these children's minds engaged. And, if one of them climbed a tree and disturbed somebody, they would come to me and, Annie was climbing that tree and I told her not to, and she kept climbing. And I'm like, okay, So I'd take Annie and talk to her and I'd say, okay, just don't tell them. Just don't say that we didn't discipline you, because then I would get in trouble for not, supporting my brothers. And
If you're in a system that believes that God speaks through the body, that's basically was our doctrine, that you heard Christ speak through your brothers as the primary source. You could be easily deceived if you judge Christ by yourself, but your brothers could tell you what Christ was saying. So that puts you in this, you're very obligated to do what people tell you to do, and you can't trust yourself. So it sets you up in this terrible kind of bind as a parent. Your heart's telling you one thing, but the people that you're aligned with, that supposedly is God's voice to you, is telling you to do something else. And, sometimes we would go one way and sometimes we would go the other. We weren't always perfect at it.
I was compared to a woman who died from speaking against the leader, Gene Spriggs, and how he disciplined one of her children, because she said he can be harsh. And so she died because of that. And, then the elders would talk to me and compare me with her. And inside I was like, whoa, good for me. I think she was a good mother. But I had to, outwardly act like that was a shameful thing because I was a nurturing, caring person. And that was all the kind of thing that I needed to judge in me, to be affectionate to my children and to be protective of them. So, these kids that we were around when we were raising our kids have all grown up, and most of them have left. And they were the children that were being born when the teachings were coming in about taking our children and passing on the life that we have to them so that they would carry the baton. And we got out before all those youth started leaving, but I just often wonder about the parents who are still there and raised those kids and watched them leave and can't follow them and make sure they're okay, but knowing that the teachings said that those kids would grow up to love the life that we have and believe what we believed, and it just didn't happen. It maybe happened with a few. And so I'm just glad I wasn't there as a parent and had to see my children walk away and think, that's my fault. We're both going to have to be, judged someday. As a parent, we failed. And these kids, a lot of them didn't have ties with relatives because in the group you don't really have much to do with your real family because the group is your new family. So these kids are out, and some of them have done really well. I'd say a good bit of them have done really well. They're skilled with their hands. They can practically build a house, but they can't write or read. And they'll start their own businesses, and they'll hardly be able to fill out a contract. My hope is that somehow these kids can be compensated and have opportunity to get an education, and if they're not able to at least be able to offer it to their children. And, medical abuse, medical neglect, babies dying just because they wouldn't go to the hospital, plenty of preventable things. Mothers dying of cancer because they wanted to have faith that God would heal them, and they left a nursing baby behind and 5 other kids. And just playing with human life and, moving the pieces around like a puzzle. Well, you go here and you do this, and your child needs to be beat because he was disrespectful. Well, why don't you let me decide if my child was disrespectful? Because I don't really think what he did was disrespectful. And then there's that pressure that, oh yeah, well, I love God and I want to be attached to him and to the Holy Spirit, so I have to trust my brothers, and a lot of turmoil that I would like to see some justice come for the kids and for somebody to be held accountable for the abuse that many of them have gone through. So that's, even why I was glad to get this connection, because I don't know if anybody has any kind of direction for me that would make it possible for me to bring to light what really goes on in the 12 tribes. I'm open to listen to anybody. So,
thank you for that. Trish, did you want to answer?
Well, something that just popped into my mind, and it's so minor compared to some of these other things I've been hearing, but it kind of characterizes the situation. When my daughter was about, I think she was in the 2nd grade, very small, she wanted to take dancing lessons, and that was really not encouraged. Any type of extracurricular activities were not encouraged by the witnesses, but she really wanted to take dancing lessons, and so I let her. I took her to dancing lessons. Well, it came time for the recital, and the theme of the recital was Mickey Mouse's birthday party. Well, the ones in here who are ex-witnesses know that you don't celebrate birthdays. That's a pagan thing to do. You just don't do it. That's not pleasing. So even though it really wasn't a real birthday party, I talked to the elders, and they said, well, it's the name of it is a birthday party, so don't let her participate. And, something that she really wanted to do for some stupid reason, she wasn't able to do it. A little bit more substantial was when she graduated from high school, she was valedictorian of her class. And in Texas, at that time, I don't know if it's still this way, but valedictorian gets their tuition, college tuition paid for a couple of semesters or a certain amount of time. Anyway, because they discouraged going to college, she didn't go to college. And so she gave that up. So that's just a couple of things I thought about.
Thanks for sharing that. Well, there are a lot more things I want to ask you all about, but I want to give others a chance to ask questions. Okay, Christy? Oh, wait for the mic.
Thanks, you guys, for... Am I on? Yeah, okay. For sharing. To the two couples on the end, we may have some people in common, so we may have to chat later if you would like that, because, I have quite a history in the ministry in the country and grew up very similar to you, very similar. Anyway, I just wanted to validate that piece in all of you that went back towards truth and light, towards attachment, because I think in a lot of religion, especially the themes we're talking about here, parents are asked to ignore their natural sense of attachment and care for their child. So whatever you believe in here, whether it was evolved or God gave it to you, whatever it is, that is an inborn thing to humanity. And when I was doing therapy, a lot of what I did with trauma was also attachment. And as a mother who came from some of this, becoming a mother, I had to work really hard to say, this is normal, right, and good. That I would get down on my child's level and say, that must really hurt, or that must be so hard for you. And I had to learn this through lots of courses, but then through treating people, and then I had to learn it because my parents were too busy and too punitive, and to some degree, my mother has admitted ignoring her attachment signal. So all of you, you've gone back to that deepest place that is in you that said, we can't survive without attachment. And I just, you guys are awesome. So thank you for sharing. It means a ton to me as a kiddo from similar circumstance. So thank you.
Thank you for that. I got to see a hand raised, or I'm not going to know who's. Okay. Okay, go ahead, Steve.
I just wanted to ask Joellen to tell your story about your illness and what led to you leaving, because I think there's a lot more that people can learn about the whole.
Okay.
Please.
I gotta dig it up. Let's see. Well, when I joined the 12 tribes, I was taking medication. I was hypothyroid when I was a child, and that medicine was kind of frowned upon. And when I first got married was the first time they had me go off it. And because they believed God could heal me. So I went off it, and I started getting sick, and I knew the signs. I started kind of metabolically slowing down and gaining weight and processing slower, and I just got scared. And so I said, I want to go back on my medicine. So to them, I was lacking faith, but they let me go back on my medicine. Well, then, how many years later? 5 kids later.
10, 15 years later.
I developed rheumatoid arthritis. And he was always at elders' meetings in the evenings, and I was at home with the children. And I was raised Catholic, so I think I was good at being, and I was German also. So I think I was good at like following rules, and enforcing rules. And so I'd have my children, and I would read them a story and bathe them, and they'd brush their teeth, and then I'd put them in bed, and I'd say, okay, you guys be quiet and go to bed. And they were all in the same bedroom. Well, I was asking them something impossible. So I was setting myself up for frustration. So I'd have to go in and spank them. And this happened all the time, and I'm like, why could Roger not be home to help me raise these kids? He seems to like to help me have them. And I was getting bitter. And one night in bed, I just was honest with myself, and I said, I am so miserable. And it was like right after that where my body just started freezing up. And I was like having a hard time moving, and I was in pain. And it just kept getting worse and worse and worse. And then Roger said, well, I'm going to take her and get her diagnosed. Because I think they thought, well, diagnosis might be okay, but treatment, no. So I got diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis. And so then we started all these natural things that, the AMA doesn't really approve of or anything, but they're out there. The acupuncture, the moxibustion, the different diets, bee stings.
We tried it all. Everything but take medication.
And so nothing was really working. And so it was because of sin. And so I needed to deal with that. That was the reason that I was sick, was God was wanting to purify us. And, he was kind of pinpointing there's problems here. So I didn't know what it could possibly be. I wasn't aware that I was sinning. And so we'd start going to meetings and being asked questions. And the whole community, which is like hundreds of people, and we had been there, close to 20 years, everybody was told, well, anything that's ever happened between you and Amitai or Dinah, bring it up so that we can maybe find out what the sin is. So people started like bringing up things that happened years ago, and I was like, really? But, you start getting picked apart. And, well, we were cooking in the kitchen and she was letting her children eat something or whatever. I mean, when you live communally like we did, it's like the chickens, having too many chickens in a chicken pen, and they start pecking on each other. And that's what it was like. You just, your whole world is right there, just right in front of you, and it's like a magnifying glass on everything. And So they had to figure out what sin it was. We would have what we called body meetings where people would come together, and they were so heavy and deep. And when people start scrutinizing you and talking about eternal life and eternal death, and the only way to avoid eternal death was by having your sins confessed. And some people were really cruel during this time. And there's, living communally, there's going to be people that you naturally just can't stand. You don't get along with, but you're forced to live with them, and you teach their children, and you have to interact with them. And there was a couple people in particular who really didn't like me. And they could just be really cruel in talking about my children and how, this child did this and this child did that, and you didn't discipline them, and you're failing the child training teachings that are from the apostle. Help me. It was months of being scrutinized, and I was
sick because the judgment was that you were sick because you had refused the direction from the apostle and to not quit taking your Synthroid. And so you had all these years of disobedience.
So he wanted me to test me again.
It caused you to have rheumatoid arthritis.
Okay.
Okay, so
they wanted me to go off my medicine again.
The only way to be saved from this would be to stop taking the Synthroid.
And I was seriously sick with my rheumatoid arthritis. I couldn't care for my children. And at the same time, people were saying, well, we can't really help you until we figure out what sin has been committed so that you can be cleansed. And they take you to the water and, dunk you in the water and cleanse you. So when I needed my friends that I lived with almost 20 years at that time, when I needed them the most in my pain and suffering, they weren't there. And that did kind of help us disconnect and say, wait a minute, these are people that we've shared everything with for 20 years, Okay.
First of all, thank you, each and every one of you, for your courage and your willingness. I really appreciate it, and for your vulnerability. And for your recovery. Thank you. My question is, for those of you that were parents in these situations, did you ever discuss this with your children? Because I'm really struck by how in your own selves it sounds like you were always thinking, even when you were in the midst of the situations, that you did have, at least privately, your own thoughts and your own responses of disagreement maybe with what was going on. So I'm curious, did you ever, and if so, how did you communicate this to your children, that somehow you created to me, what would be a really constructive wedge, that somehow you gave them the message that, what, everything isn't all groovy here, that there's something, you know what I'm saying? What I'm asking you, it seems like you must have communicated somehow to your children that there was another way to live or think or something. I'm curious about that.
I'm not sure if this actually answers your question, but I know I used to, when my husband would be abusive and do things to my daughter, I would always talk to her and say, if you can learn to stand this, you'll be able to stand anything. And, and remind her that this is what the Bible teaches, or supposedly, that you should do. And she's a pretty strong person now, but she still has issues from years of abuse.
I want to ask John a question. As a parent and as a survivor, do you find yourself ever needing to kind of write things in your mind? Like if you're communicating with your child now, are there times where you find yourself going down a road just that the way you were raised, or do you feel like you've worked on this so much over the years that you can kind of put that behind you in terms of your parenting style?
My wife would probably be able to tell you better, but I don't think I parent in a similar way at all. First of all, I think in this type of situation, kids are being taught to be sheep. The Bible talks a lot about being sheep. I was taught to be a sheep. And I think my main goal with my son is teach him how to be a shepherd and how to be a leader. Obviously, there are, my parents and I have some crossover beliefs. Like I said earlier, you don't need religion to have morals. I have some similar morals to my parents. I still consider myself a very moral person. And if anything, I probably think about that sort of thing too much. But as far as, we may have the same outcome. I may be teaching some of the same things, but the intention and where it's born from is completely different. It's not about going to hell. It's not about punishment. Because really, good character is what you do when nobody's watching. I mean, if the only reason all of us stay moral is fear of hell, or God not liking us, or this, that, and the other, I mean, even if you have a perfect scorecard, that's not being a good person. I think it's more impressive if someone doesn't believe there's any consequences at all and yet decides to do the right thing. And that's what I hope to teach my son is you want to do the right thing, not because I'm going to punish you. You're your own person. I can't really tell you what to do. I can't tell my son what to do. He's 5. I really can't. Do whatever he wants to. He's got free will. I'm there to protect him from himself and from others, and live by example with how I treat and interact with other people. There's some things that are just universally true. I'm not going to try to explain them to you. I don't know, and I'm probably wrong, and so are you. The likelihood of any of us being right is very small. And that's something I definitely want to teach my son that I wasn't taught. That's very contrasting with my parents. My parents are very, very convinced that they're right. I'm convinced that I'm wrong. I don't know anything. I don't. And I think that's fine. I think it's fine not to know.
Thank you. Let's hear from Bethany and then both in the back.
So this is for those of you who raise children in your respective religions. So I'm the oldest of 4 children, and each one of us have had to come to some sort of conclusion or healing work in terms of how our parents chose to raise us in the punishments that you described. And I've watched my parents try to reconciliate with us, attempt to, and really struggle with it, because when they say, I'm sorry, it really, for them it's painful because they have to be real with what they did. And I know that that's also a stumbling block in terms of getting parents to change their ways to something more healthy. And I was wondering what advice you would give to those of us in working with parents and how to relate to them and what it's like, say I was wrong or I shouldn't have done this, or I, as you said, you suppressed that inner desire to protect them. What do those conversations look like, and what advice do you have in terms of engaging those parents in those conversations?
I spent quite a few years in Al-Anon, so I learned something there that really helped me. Everybody does the best they can with the tools that they have. I think if we had had better tools, we would have done better, but we didn't. So that's kind of I've been able to forgive my parents for the things they did, and I keep telling my children that if I would have been able to do better, I would have done better. But I was sick, so that's my answer.
Can I do a follow-up to your question? What if the parent is still in the faith community? What if they haven't come to the point where you all have? Any advice you can give to children who are just wanting to maintain a relationship with those parents, but in a way that's meaningful but also safe?
I think I can kind of take that one. It's tricky. It's one reason I don't want to be filmed. I desire to have a relationship with my parents because the truth is they love me very much. That was never a question of mine. They belong to an organization and a religion that I believe traumatizes children and probably still does to a degree. But my preference is to, this sounds kind of shallow and wrong, but the only way I can really have a relationship with them is in a very shallow manner. They can't really know me intimately. And it's really too bad for them. You know, it hurts both of us. They don't really even know that our relationship is strained. You know, for me to come out as a non-believer to them, you know, I'm from Mississippi, deep South, Bible Belt. I mean, it would be akin to one of my friends that came out as a homosexual. It would be about kind of the same. And unfortunately, that spills over into how I deal with my son. I'm not especially pumped that he's going to an Episcopal school. When he comes home and talks about God and Jesus, it disturbs me because I feel like I'm lying. And I can't tell him what I believe because what do kids do? They run their mouths. So the best you can do is have a shallow relationship, at least in my experience. And unfortunately, it's better than no relationship at all because I would really miss my parents. I love them. They love me. But we don't accept each other's lifestyles, ultimately.
Thank you.
My question is actually quite similar, maybe to Brittany's, and that is, for those of you who had kids and then left, how did you know how to parent? I mean, did you figure this out? And then I was curious how you saw what kind of impact, if there was any, that you could see on your kids as they've grown up. You know, that transition, how did this impact them, and how did you figure out how to parent? I mean, obviously you came from families, so you had some idea. But how about that transition for you?
I wouldn't want to minimize the effect of a bad experience on children, but looking at our family, to me it's completely amazing that our children are as intact as they are. And I think that it's because we maintain a close relationship with our kids even when we were in a very difficult environment. We stayed very close to them. We kept them close. We communicated frequently with them. And when we left this group, we kept it a secret from them. Someone asked me earlier about that, and we didn't let them know. We never spoke negatively about the group, partially because we were afraid that they would rat us out, and then we'd be, you know, it would be difficult. But partially because I just thought that it would just create some sort of confusion in them. So, you know, they just believed what we told them about the group. You know, every day we walked past the VFW, and there was a big cannon out there, and I told my son that was a manure spreader, and he believed it his whole life that a cannon was a manure spreader. I'm sorry, it's just a silly example to me. He just believed it because I was his dad, and that's what I said. You know, and so they believed the world that we created for them. When we left, I had a lot of guilt. I mean, I had not just guilty feelings, but I really did have a lot of guilt. Even though I was in a system where I was very strongly manipulated, and I had very little freedom to act on my own, had a very restricted environment. Still, as a parent, I was their primary protector, and I had some guilt because I allowed them to be abused. So I had to take the heat for that. I felt like, so did this, and I would advise anyone in this situation to apologize thoroughly and frequently for what you did wrong with your children. And the first couple of years we were out, we regularly had sessions where we sat down and we reminded them of things that happened and said, we're sorry about this. We're sorry about this. We went through a thing where our children were separated from us for a while, were taken away from us, and I allowed that to happen. I had to thoroughly apologize for that. A number of things that they could remember, we frequently apologize. That being said, it's amazing that our kids really don't have a lot of hostility toward us about making a decision like that to raise them in that kind of environment. They're extremely forgiving for us. They really give us a pass. I don't know why, but they do. They remember other people disciplining them in the group, and they have very few negative feelings about us disciplining them. And part of it is the fact that they were younger. Part of it is that I think that they picked up on the fact that we were protecting them in some kind of way from some people who were threatening to them. But I would advise to keep communication open. That has really served us well. It's if you've got a family member that's in a controlling group, the big thing is groups. They will provide all of the family. They will all of the emotion support. They will give that to a person. But the antidote for a cult-type controlling environment is family and love from family. So I would recommend building bridges, reaching out, always be there as much as you can in their lives. But that's.
I wonder if you'd be willing to speak at all about the position of women in these various groups and how you think that relates to the way children are treated.
Well, a woman's role is to be submissive. So if I have a concern about how one of my children are being treated, I'm usually told, well, you need to trust the elders. If I had difficulty with that, then I'm being, talked to about being submissive, and that my own ability to reason will lead me away from the truth. It was difficult, and at different times, if my kids were around people who were more severe, it's just something I had to deal with. I would probably try to keep them away from that kind of a person as much as possible, but that's not always in my control.
Can I ask you another question about that? Was there anything, and don't answer if you don't want to, but was there anything that was comfortable and warm and easy about that submission? I mean, as you look back on it, you apparently embraced it, or at least went through it for many years, and certainly other people do. I imagine there was a part of it that was in some way appealing, even though now you're rejecting it, or am I totally off base about that?
No, I am rejecting it. You can ask my husband.
I guess what I'm saying, the position I'm coming from is of, thinking about women who are in submissive relationships, mm-hmm. and they reject it, and yet at the same time there were parts of it that were that they didn't entirely reject.
Well, when I met Roger, we got along really well, and he was never abusive and never demanded submission from me. I would try to be respectful and be submissive, and it really wasn't me though, So when we left and were away from that environment, I think I changed more quickly than he changed, because I was starting to be my old self that I was 21 years ago, and I'm like, no. So, yeah, I didn't like being submissive. It was always difficult for me. And he had to be submissive, too, to his people that were over him. And it was just as difficult for him, because he would be being told things. And, I was what I call a Kool-Aid drinker when I lived in there. I would have, as far as I know, gone that far. He wasn't a Kool-Aid drinker. He always kind of, in the back of his mind. He would come, I know he came home one night and he just said, just trying to beat his head on the floor, saying, help me just trust and submit to this, because things he was being told just didn't. He had to be told at one point that he hated his family. That's when I had gotten sick, and they were wanting to blame it on him because he was always gone to meetings or stuff. And they say, you hate your family. You know, and they forced him to say it. I hate my family. And when he came home from that meeting and told me about that, I just absolutely went nuts because I knew he didn't hate us. I knew he was gone because those were his responsibilities. And I didn't like him being gone all the time, but it wasn't that he hated us. And the elders forced him to say that. Or they would say, you know, you don't have your wife's heart. And I'm just like, oh my God, you know, it just made me furious. I couldn't let anybody else know I was furious except him. And at that time, that was the last couple of years we were in, and those kind of things were just kind of helping us make that decision. You know, we wanted to get out. So, and in our relationship, we just kind of make it work. We talk a lot. We usually end up on the back porch before bed talking. And raising the kids outside of the group was really difficult because he had different standards than I did, you know, and I tended to be the harder one, and he was the softer one. But we never would argue in front of the children. We would just argue on the back porch. And I still don't know how to raise children. I'm watching my kids raise their children, and I'm so proud of them because they're finding other ways. You know, they either just overlook it, you know, if a 2-year-old's got an attitude, because in about 30 seconds it's going to change anyway. But yeah, I mean, you know, I have that concern in the back of my mind, and I was talking to you about it earlier, you know, just because I didn't want them to fall into thinking that corporal punishment was going to do a bit of good, because it really doesn't work.
Thank you.
Could I just address that? I think that I knew people who maybe appreciated parts of the being submissive if their husbands were very supportive of them, because it kind of gave them, you know, they didn't have to worry about it. Their husbands were going to be the strong, the protector. But I didn't have that luxury, so I can't speak for myself. But I did know people, and my daughter is kind of that way. Her husband is really good to her, so she doesn't mind doing what he says because it's always looking out for her best interest at heart. So.
Another question, another comment or thought? I think I want to hear from each of you the question that Jacob posed early on. You said religion is too heavy for kids. And I'd like to hear your thoughts on, is there a way to teach religious faith to a child that you feel is healthy and beneficial? How to do that in a way that you feel is appropriate? What are the warnings? What are the things we have to watch out for where we are crossing over a line that is unhealthy?
Okay. The Bible's full of some pretty gruesome stories. And, you know, for me personally, I can't see reading that to my son. I can't see teaching my son about a God who would ask someone to slaughter their child or to sacrifice, or a God that would kill his own son. You know, he's supposed to be the ultimate example. I'm not killing my son for anybody, not even to save the world. You know, that's unnatural.
This is something actually that Jacob and I have been talking a lot about recently. You know, what do we want to tell him and how? And like I said earlier, I want him to know that there is more than Christianity. Whether or not I get him books on it or we Google it, I don't want him to think that is the way. he will not be getting that at home from us. But I would love for him to learn that there are different things people believe, and whatever he wants to believe, or if he doesn't want to believe, will be fine with me, but I just don't want him to be exposed just to Jesus and God as being the thing, the dude. I don't want him just to be, and especially someone he fears. I can't stand hearing people say God-fearing, and it just rubs me the wrong way. But
I'm not sure what love and fear have to do with one another. I mean, if someone can enlighten me, they're the opposite. Love and fear is not in bed together, that they don't belong. I don't want my son to fear me. Why the hell would I want that? Doesn't make sense. And if to me, I wish people would spend more time using common sense than just listening to other people. We lead each other down these weird, ridiculous paths. The problem is, like I said, we're taught to be sheep, not shepherds. Don't be a sheep. Don't teach your children to be sheep. The fact is, if you trust in God, whatever God you subscribe to, He'll take care of it anyway. Whatever your child is going to believe. But if you're teaching them something as truth before they are emotionally, physically, spiritually, if you believe in that, ready to accept it, it's brainwashing, essentially. You're teaching somebody something before they have the ability to digest it and choose for themselves. The reason why children are so popular in these religions is they're easy. It's just easy to brainwash them and train them up to be a little mini-me of you. And that's awfully conceited for anyone to think that there should be another one of themselves.
Trish?
After being out of Jehovah's Witnesses for maybe 20 years, I really wanted a community. And I don't have, my children are all grown now. I do have grandchildren, though. I looked around for a community, and I definitely did not want a Christian community after everything, my long dysfunctional religious history. So now I attend the Ethical Society of Austin, and it is a humanist religion and non-theistic. And we have a religious education class where children are taught values like loyalty, courage, compassion, but they're not taught that you do this because if you don't, God's going to do something to you. It's because it's the right thing to do. And so I think you, like John Jacob said.
John Jacob Jingleheimer Smith.
You can teach a child this. You want your child to be a good person, not because they're afraid, but because it's the right thing to do.
Empathy, not survival. That place sounds interesting, by the way.
I was just going to say one thing. I explained our environment a little bit about how we raised our children, very high pressure, two at least 1 hour meetings a day, 7 days a week, heavy indoctrination, all of that sort of stuff. We left the group. My kids retained none of that. And they got it just pounded into them. But when we rejected it and left, they kind of much just rejected it as well. And I think a lot of value with faith and religion comes from the parents and how you put it into the children. And I think it's probably the most significant thing. I really liked what we heard earlier about making faith and our faith speech and talking, making it child-friendly, making sure that we're being appropriate when we communicate Bible stories, all sorts of things. so that we can be really clear with our kids and feel good about what we're teaching them. But I think ultimately it just has to do with being healthy as parents. That's my take on it.
I would also like to add, I think if you have to sugarcoat your religion to your children in order to keep them safe, something's wrong with your religion. A good way to teach your kids the stories or whatnot, there should just be the truth. And if the truth is ugly and gross, then it's probably ugly and gross. Use your best judgment, common sense.
A question for perhaps mental health professionals who are with us. One thing we're trying to do is encourage faith communities to work with child development experts in developing their curriculum, not just for children, but also in their parenting classes. And so I wonder if there's a therapist or maybe a child psychologist or someone with that kind of experience who might want to speak at all about, teaching faith to children in a way that's age appropriate and healthy. You'd be the ideal person, I think. Can we get a mic to Christy? Thank you.
This is such a debated subject, like you said, because some people would say if it's any religion, it's any damage. And on the progressive end of things, they're in more liberal interpretations of different faiths. You can teach the themes of your scriptures, whatever holy scriptures they are, and some of the stories that relate to the themes you want to get across, like courage and empathy and care and loyalty, the things in the best sort of way. I've heard some in the Christian tradition, more in the progressives lately, say absolutely some stories should never be put out there for children because you can't spin them. And now that's a highly debated thing because people have been telling their children myths, legends, fairy tales that are violent and things like that throughout the ages. But I think that you have to provide children at all costs with the caveat of here is what some people believe about this story, and here's what other people believe about this story. What do you think your heart wants to believe? What do you think children are going to lean towards? Children are going to lean towards empathy and towards courage and towards a concept of a God who's love. So does that make sense to that regard? It doesn't really answer it, but it gives some streams of options of either don't include it or and include it when they're older, or if you must include it, you must also provide a caveat with it, which to some people, like you say, you would say that's sugarcoating. And again, we give children stories all the time. So, yeah, it's a hard one.
Pete?
I think, like many things that we talk to our kids about, our stuff comes through. And that's going to be the same as we present religion or faith to our kids. And if our view of God is one that focuses on wrath, condemnation, then that is probably what's going to come through to our kids, is the wrath and the condemnation. If our view of God is someone who is absolutely ridiculously crazy about us and willing to do anything to get to us because we are that important, we are that valuable, we are that amazing of a creation or a creature, well, then that flows through. And that doesn't end up becoming something that's abusive. Instead, that becomes a foundation of self-worth and value. Really, as parents, where we're at in our understanding of God or faith is what is going to naturally flow to our kids with difficult subjects. I sugarcoat things to my kids all the time. I'm not telling my 10-year-old daughter why it's a little bit difficult for me to trust that she'll be okay walking to the bus stop alone. You know, we've got people in not too far from here who, from where we live, that will talk about somebody trying to pick them up while they were at the bus stop. I'm not telling my daughter all the details of why I'm concerned about that. I'm letting her know I'm concerned and that there is a reason that I got these rules. So some things, just for me, some things I do choose what aspects to tell them. But again, I think the main thing is just that our view of God is going to come through.
Take this back to what you said about common sense.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Hi. So, for me as a former cult member and as a therapist who's worked with a lot of people coming out of cults, I think it's important to kind of each person in each case be analyzed in a customized kind of way. And I'm friends with Roger and Joelle, and I know your father was a minister. You were educated with the Bible more, in my opinion, better than the leader who is the apostle of the cult. And therefore, even though you were a leader and you were controlled, he knew you knew more about the Bible than them. And it created a different dynamic, as I understand it, so that you could get away with things. They had to bend the system in order to keep you under control and such. But to get back to the bigger theme that I just want to share, which is the best thing for children, for parents who've been in a cult, is for the parents to get well and for the parents to heal. And part of that healing, I really believe, is understanding undue influence and mind control and understanding what was done to them but also what's healthy, like what's normal developmental psychology. And if you hadn't been raised in that environment, what were the patterns that would bring about health? And what else? And in terms of age-appropriate teaching, I think in this 21st century, I just finished watching Cosmos, the redo of the series Carl Sagan did in 1980. I don't know who've seen it, with Neil deGrasse Tyson. It's a fabulous series because it creates such wonder and how much we don't know and how much throughout history different institutions said they knew what the truth was and science proved that it wasn't. And it creates this reality testing. You know what? You should ask questions and don't just follow what everyone else is saying, because they may be wrong. But it also puts out the fact that 90% of what's out there is unknown. It's dark matter. We don't understand it. We don't know it. Okay, so that means we know only 10%, and we're this tiny little planet floating around. And however we want to understand God and the Almighty, it's got to encompass everything, and it just widens things out in a way that I think, because I am a person of faith, but my conceptualization is not an anthropomorphization of a human being as it was painted in the Torah and in the New Testament. And I just think that we need to kind of model a healthy spirituality that is love-centered and is empathy and faith-oriented and communal, because we don't know, but we also can see the negative effects that if we don't live that way, life sucks. And there's no hope if we don't, live up to ideals and be righteous and do social good. So I guess I'm just trying to say that there's a way of framing spirituality in a non-literal interpretation of any scripture, with using both sides of the brain, understanding the history of religion, and just taking a posture with kids of, hey, I don't know everything, I don't believe everything in our scriptures, but I'm open to learning and hearing from other points of view, as opposed to just being reactive or negative or saying it's all black and white or all or nothing. So that's kind of a few thoughts I wanted to share.
I think I might answer as a mom, because as I've been hearing you discuss that, I kind of think about what's important to me about how I raise my child, to be as open as possible, to I don't want to close doors for her. So what I find myself saying, and this isn't just only about faith issues, but really any of my values or philosophies, I tend to, I find myself, hardly ever saying, well, this is true. I know this, this is the way it is. I usually am just honest with her and say, this is what I believe. And I just make it clear that this is just me, and that other people feel differently about things, and she may feel, differently herself and develop her own ideals and beliefs. I think I'd like to hear your thoughts on this, but I think where kids are in trouble is when there's exploitation, because there's some kind of agenda on the part of the parent where they're, seeing the child as a possession. They're wanting to kind of live their life or their faith through a child, and it goes to the idea of controlling and owning children, instead of seeing them as individuals. So I guess just the idea of it's okay for there to be uncertainty seems to be an important thing in how I raise my child. Stacy?
I was raised in a community, a Christian faith, Baptist, but it was very progressive, and we worshipped with the local synagogue monthly. We had a member of staff who went and spent time at a Buddhist monastery, and came back and said, "There's no doubt that I believe that we worship the same God." And later, as my faith progresses, it changes to God reveals him or herself to each individual the way that they're going to understand. And some people that's nature religions, and some people that. So this idea that even though I was raised in a Baptist church, which sounds very, you wouldn't think what most people understand about Baptists that this would be the way it was, but it wasn't hellfire, damnation, punishment, and that God was, fire insurance, and that you had to have this belief or else something bad was going to happen. But it gave us the opportunity to learn many different things, and I don't know, and allowed us to kind of form our own understanding of our faith. I'm very grateful for that.
I think that a common denominator is being developed in brain science and whatever, because it's been shown that the brain and the body react better from a health standpoint when people are treated with compassion, and you don't have the cortisol flowing, and you don't have the amygdala overstimulated. And the treating children positively is backed by the latest developments in science like I never saw before. And I think this message has to come out too. And that might be a common denominator between religions, is the fact that the way our brain works. With your heart, you wouldn't tell somebody to smoke cigarettes and, eat tons of fat and stuff like that. And the same thing with the brain and it's very similar to how you raise children. You're giving them comfort, and empathy is probably the most. It helps the brain develop the best, no matter what religion you are.
I think we can hear one more, and then I thought maybe if each of you want to just give a closing comment before we wrap up. Is there any? Anne.
As a person of faith, first of all, I want to apologize on behalf of faith communities that have hurt you and have hurt your children, because I know that there are misuses and abuses within faith communities, and I think that's a reason why we need an organization like this and a conference like this about child-friendly faith, because I do think that faith and faith communities can be child-friendly and empowering and affirming and protective, and as you say, let children know, not just by their own parents and grandparents and the people close to them, but by a divine entity, how valued and how loved and how important they are. And I think those are very important values that kids can have. People have really manipulated the system and have misinterpreted things, and some of them have just been sick, psychopathic, control freak, personality disordered people in some of the communities wanting to control and abuse people. But I think that we can't throw out the baby with the bathwater. I think we need to see what makes a faith community safe for children and a positive experience for children, and support those communities. I know that in the designation program, we're going to have a way for faith communities to identify, to be identified to a certain degree as holding certain values and practices that will help that. But I do think that it is so important, because we can see the damage that is done to children by being in abusive faith communities, not only just to them as individuals, but in their relationship to God, in relationship to a larger community. And I think that is a great loss to faith communities. But I do want to apologize on behalf. I don't think I've been an abusive faith person, but I know people who hold some of my beliefs have, in the name of those beliefs, abused people. And so I personally want to apologize to you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ann. Okay, well, if each of you if you could give a 2-minute thought, that'd be great. Thanks.
Well, I think with my family, time has been a friend to us, because when the children and us were all together at the same time, starting over, I didn't have a lot of answers. I didn't have a lot of direction, but we stayed together, and we always said, I don't care what it is our child has to say. They need to know that in our home they can say whatever it is, whether it's anger, frustration. Why didn't you discipline Ezra when he did that? And they were still thinking that that's how they were supposed to be raised. But over time and growing up and staying in communication and working through life issues together, I'm very proud of our family and our closeness, and that my kids can come over at any time, call us at any time, tell us anything, and they know we're there for them, and that's about the only thing we know that we can do. We would like to live in another part of the country, but we're staying where we're at simply because that's where our kids are at, and we feel like, I want to be there for them. So.
I think I just wanted to say that I really appreciate the helping professions, and that people who go out of their way and devote their lives, give their resources to help people who have been traumatized or hurt or have lacks. And I went through a very traumatic thing. I got tricked into it. I didn't really know what I was getting into, but I was still there. It happened to me. But there have been people who have helped us to put our lives back together. And I really want to just send a shout out to everyone who does this kind of stuff every day, works with families, works with kids. I really appreciate it. When we kind of worked ourselves out of this cult that we were in through a number of ways. It took a long time. And it's good to get out of the cult, but it's the worst way to take that long. It's really good to if your loved one is getting sucked into a high control group, marshal all the resources you can to reach that person while they're young and they're not deeply entrenched. But that being said, when we left, we had a lot of hurt, a lot of crazy things that need to be unwound in our lives. And there were people that helped us. My parents reached out to us, which was really pretty amazing. You know, we arrived at my parents' house with 6 kids, and we lived in their living room for 6 months. They had this tiny little house. They had very little resources. You know, I appreciate them to this day for it. There was Bob and Judy Pardon contacted us. I don't know any of you know them. They didn't have anything to do with us leaving, but they contacted us and said, hey, I heard you were in the 12 tribes you just left. How are you doing? Can we help you? And they were a tremendous resource to just counsel us to understand what had happened to us. And Steve has been a great friend of mine and a resource. And we've just had all people along the way, and I appreciate it. So, you know, there is a tremendous amount of hope. Love conquers all. And I just appreciate the help that we've received. I'm really particularly happy to be a part of being able to come to this gathering here. It's just been really kind of therapeutic for us, I think.
Well, when I left Jehovah's Witnesses, it was, I think I've said 28 years ago now. And at that time, I identified as an ex-Jehovah's Witness. But I have I've healed enough now to where I hardly ever even think about that. I mean, this has brought up a lot of stuff because I don't normally even think about it. But anyway, I appreciate you giving me the opportunity to speak, Jan. And I'm just glad to be here.
Thanks, everyone, for listening. Hopefully I haven't offended anyone. But I think the chief takeaway, as I see it, for me and my story is to be brave enough to be wrong. I don't think it's our responsibility as parents to always be right. And I think, if anything else, you get respect from your children by admitting to being human. There's nothing wrong with not knowing. There's nothing wrong with telling your child, I don't know. If you're convinced of yourself, that's fine. But just please remember the fact that my parents and I can't have this conversation. And just ask yourself if you would like that to be the same of you and your child. You know, do you really? Is it worth it? You know, is being right worth it? So I think above all, accepting your children as individuals who may or may not think like you. Just like I have to forgive and understand that my parents are individuals and they're actually nice, lovely people that did the best they could. And that was the decision they made, and I'm going forward making decisions for my family. And that's just the way that it is. So hopefully we can all respect each other. Seems like often we respect other people more than we respect our children and our parents, which is kind of sad. So respect your parents, respect your children as individuals. So thank you.
I just want to say that I'm proud of everybody up here and hope others get the healing they need.
Thank you all so much.